What's a Zago? What is a Zago? You know, I saw Gilmore in a restaurant yesterday, and he said, "I'm coming to see a Zago," but he didn't show up. Close to the back so you can exit it. What's a Zago? Something you eat? A phrase to repeat? A postmodern cause? Neo-modern with flaws? Found on both coasts? Or a theory that's toast? There are histories of architecture written from the outside in, and histories of architecture written from the inside out. Outside in history is architecture's story, told by authorities that monitor the proceedings and offer a learned interpretation of same. Their reading is an extrovert's narrative expressed in architecture's predictable lexicon and traditional nomenclature. They offer the architect's life packaged in standard categories we all recognize. Why the categories? Categories purport to manage the architecture endeavor by describing it piecemeal, a comfortable habit, but intellectually dubious. Categories of general knowledge often appear as topical Dewey Decimal subdivisions. Archaeology, or astronomy, or poetry, for instance. But suppose the archaeologist excavates an antique sky map wrapped in a poetic shroud. What happens to the categories? Here's a caricatured rendition of the outside-inner standard categories for architecture. Architecture is generational, or architecture is regional, or architecture is contingent on social and political predilections, or architecture is contingent on environmental affinities, or architecture belongs to art, or architecture belongs to utility, or architecture belongs to its pre-digital, digital, or post-digital tools, or architecture belongs to its pre-industrial, industrial, or post-industrial associations. And most ubiquitous of categorical conventions, architecture is modern, or postmodern, or neo-modern. But categorization is superfluous with respect to our search for a Zago. No Zago fits are to be found in on the aforementioned list. And now comes the alternative, the history of architecture from inside out. C.S. Lewis is its author, an introvert's narrative. Remember the architectural chronicles of Narnia? Out the back door of the closet, where only inside-outers are permitted, there are clues, models from Korea, exhibits from New York, buildings from Detroit, and lectures from Los Angeles. Architect Lewis taught us that Zago architecture is likely to be discovered only in that intellectual land without a priori labels. I have a suggestion for the generationalists and digitalists and neo-modernists and post-industrialists. Looking for a Zago? Tonight, let's recognize Andrew Zago as a new category of contemporary architecture. Please welcome category A, Zago, to SCI-Arc.
Thank you. Actually, inside architecture, outside architecture was exactly one of the things I was going to talk about, so you're prescient again. It's a couple of things. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the introduction. You're asked to give a title for a lecture, or I'm asked to give a title for a lecture long before what I'm going to talk about, which is to say if I'm asked to give a title like a week before I'm going to speak. So I took a title from some things I'd been talking about, and I talked about the awkward, and I'm sure a lot of you, the students and colleagues, have heard me talk about it. I've written a little bit about it, and I consider it an important position to lay out in terms of contemporary strategies and sensibilities. But that's not really what I was going to talk about tonight. But then I realized, well, in another way, I think, and I know this from talking to some of my colleagues here at SCI-Arc who've lectured here before, I think it could just stand as the title for every time a faculty member lectures at SCI-Arc, because I can think of no more awkward position to be in than standing up here right now. What I wanted to do, a couple of things. First off, the inside, outside. There's a number of people who are in the field, and if they were to lecture, really the only thing they would have to speak about is things that would address a general understanding of architecture and a kind of discussion that one could have, say, with a person on the street. There's other times where, and I think this would maybe describe a lot of us here, who would have an option. In other words, we are in positions and places where we have to have a discussion in which we are not speaking necessarily internally amongst ourselves, but creating certain bridges with various kinds of constituencies and publics. But then I think there's other occasions, and I think, what I want to do is actually maybe request that, to the extent that I can do it, and I know that others who speak here do it, that I think one good thing about SCI-Arc is that one ought to, when here, try as far as possible to have a professional discourse among colleagues. So I would rather risk a kind of inside baseball talk in this occasion than risk being a kind of generalist or public discussion about. And I realize there's different people in the audience, but I was telling some people, I remember when I was visiting faculty for a while at Cornell, I was with the School of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering. They would also have a lecture series. Some of them sounded fascinating. I would go and sit in a lecture. Invariably, within about 3 minutes, I had absolutely no idea what they were talking about. This wasn't considered a problem, and I thought, if you're designing an airplane, please don't do things that I can understand very easily. Just let me understand how to sit in that plane and use it. So I don't apologize for that. I think it's important to have that. So I'm going to do. Let's see. So this is not a. There's a series of topics that I want to talk, and I guess I would like to categorize it more as notes from the field. And observations from the field rather than a kind of completely composed lecture. But what I wanted to do, and I remember this, sometimes I go to see classical musical performances, and maybe it's my Catholic upbringing from being in church. I always like to have a program to keep track of where things are, just so I know when it's going to be over, just in case. So I wanted to tell you all of the parts that I'm going to have in my talk today, so you can keep track. And because I don't know, I think the sweet spot is like 50 minutes to an hour and 10 minutes, but I've been known to deliver some real stem winders without meaning to. So I'm going to try not to do that, but so you know, there's part one, which is the introduction, which I just finished, so that's done. Part two, I'm going to speak about other architects, which is very unusual for me, but I'm going to do that. Part three, I'm going to speak about part three, I'm going to speak about 2 chairs. Part 4, I'm going to talk about some what I call surface studies, for lack of a better term. Then I have a little interlude where I'm just going to show some things very quickly. Part 5 is a museum project. Part 6 is a suburban project. So when you get to that, we're almost the end. In fact, the last one is part 7, which is really, I think, part 6.A, because it's part of the same suburban project. So that's the thing, that's what I'm going to show. So we're already on the part 2. Others. It's funny, just go back for a second. I thought it would be useful to talk about how the nature of professional relationships, how one interacts with and is affected by other architects. I'm going to speak, and I guess this is the presumption one makes in a lecture like this is I'm speaking in terms of my own views and my own experiences with it, and that for one reason or another, my presumption is you're going to find it interesting. I might be wrong, and it's dark here, I can't see you if you want to leave, but I'm going to speak a little bit about that, and I see it as there's a handful of relationships. There's one relationship to other architects which accounts for the vast majority of architects, which is I have no relationship with them whatsoever. That is to say, I don't know them personally, I don't have any personal professional contact with them, and their work doesn't affect my thinking about architecture at all. That's most architects. I assume for a lot of you, you would put most architects in that category. Then the other ones, I list them like this, that there's people that have colleagues that you have an ongoing relationship with and they influence your work, colleagues that you have an important ongoing relationship with, they have no influence on your work, and then there's varying degrees of colleagues that sort of shift in and out of that. Then there's another category which are those that are not colleagues at all, you don't know them at all, and yet they influence your work. And the last one, it's a special category that I'm going to call productive misunderstanding, which is works of people who you're pretty sure you're misunderstanding and you make something out of that anyways. So again, the first category, no relation, that's almost anyone. The second one, the best example of that I think is Jeff Kipnis. That's someone, well, I've worked with him for a long time. A lot of you may know he was even my partner at some point. Known him for years. For a long time, I had, in fact, a standing I agree with Jeff policy. Like if someone said, well, Jeff said, I said, well, if he said that, I agree with it. He knows I've rescinded that policy. It's still largely true, but not exactly true. But I can think of few people that have affected my thinking more. How would I prove that? Well, I'm showing this, which is a picture I took this morning. And it's a very unusual tree. If you look, the bottom of the tree is actually painted brick. The lower half of the tree is fully round, living thing. The column of the tree is off to the right, and it's a perfect cylinder. The top half of this tree is a painted atmospheric effect, and the very top of the tree is actually shifted in axes, scale, and geometry. So actually, this is the tree of multiple ontologies. And I thought, shit, this is a guy who actually is now making me look around the world, and I suddenly see multiple ontologies. A second category, and I'm just giving a few examples, because otherwise we could go on here forever. Neil Denari, who I also, not only, a lot of people I'm talking about, I'm friends, that doesn't necessarily mean one thing or another, but someone whose views I listen to carefully, someone who I'll actually bring to my office to look at projects in order to give me feedback on it. But I will say in all honesty, I don't really look at his work. I haven't looked at his work and thought about my architecture differently one way or the other. It has not been something that, for whatever reason, and maybe it's me, has ever challenged me. And then all of a sudden, in the last year or two, he does Chuck. He does this project in Taiwan. He did that other house that was a precursor to this. I forgot what it's called, the House Without Edges. And I thought, oh, this is something completely different. Here is a whole series of things that I had been interested in terms of certain kinds of cuspidal edges and strange figures, but clearly approaching it with a completely different set of tools. And so let me put it this way, when I'm looking at these projects of his, to a certain extent, I think I got to go back to the old drawing board and rethink certain things. So you never know. So this is the category of a colleague that has an influence eventually. Look, colleagues with no influence, there's a lot of them, and these are people that like Neil was up until I saw these projects. So if I was to talk about maybe Hernan, or I was to talk about Tom Wiscombe, or I was to talk about Coy, people who I have an incredible amount of respect for. But if I don't feel like I have to follow certain things of their work in order to influence me. Not to say, like with Neil, sometimes it happens. Tom, who, you know, of course I've known for a long time, and it goes in and out. It's funny, like I'll forget about Tom's work for a long time. I don't feel like I have to follow it, and then suddenly one morning walking through the streets of New York, I see a building that goes from solid to cream. And I thought, shit, I forgot how good he was. I've been trying to make a building disappear at the edges for years, and Tom figured out how to do that. I thought that's you know, so time and again, whether it's Diamond Ranch High School, whether it's certain corners like this, you go back and you realize, even though there isn't necessarily an ongoing discourse, that there's important things that are happening there. A strange category, this is Max Scoggin and Merrill Elam. People I just simply like. I love them. They're great, and if you know them, you're happy that you know them. And they're very capable, they're very, very talented. And then I see this building in Yale, one of the freakiest, scariest buildings I've ever seen. If you haven't seen it, it's the new health services building. I just show a couple of slides. It's brick, and I thought this is the first time I've seen actually someone make, not only like, gee, it's pretty good, they were able to make brick look not terrible. It actually makes me say, boy, I want to do a brick building now. Among other things, for those of you who've worked in brick, working with it now, you have the construction joints that always screws everything up. They figured out a way where it doesn't matter. You can't tell one way or another, and you can hardly tell it's brick. And even though where they have the windows, they put black cowling around it. And if you don't know the context, it's always interesting to see where buildings are. It's right across a scary old cemetery in New Haven. In fact, it's looking at this, you know, so get well soon. Next, this is a difficult one, and probably as close as one could get to you know, I think one thing with faculty lectures, it's very easy to approach the maudlin. Peter Zellner, where are you? But I told you I was going to mention your name. But if I was to talk about Eric Moss, that's an odd one. I mean, in a certain way, I haven't known him as long as I've known some of the other people that I've been showing, and I don't think there's any ongoing dialogue. Eric, sometimes it makes me uncomfortable. Not in a bad way, but does. But yet, in an other way, I always feel that there's a whole series of points of interest and connection, certainly in my work to his. I don't know if it's vice versa. And it would be a very difficult thing for me to summarize the way I could talk about certain features with Eric's work, and I don't know what that would be exactly. I know there's the topic of the accident, which Eric and I have had discussions about. I don't think it's a term he would use in his own work. But here in a project which shall remain nameless, is it's the closest thing I think I've ever done to an homage, and I think a kind of homage to Eric's work. The strange part maybe is that unconsciously it ended up, in retrospect, being also kind of an homage to Eisenman's Columbus Convention Center. So there you go. You never know. Here's someone who I didn't know very well at all. We had drinks a couple of times, but that was fun. I thought that was funny. Okay. Frank Lloyd Wright. This shows two things. You know, someone I did, so obviously dead people you don't have any relationship with, and from what I understand of Frank Lloyd Wright, is not someone you necessarily wanted to get to know. But this is, you know, this falls into a slightly different category, maybe slightly off topic. Contemporary strategies. I had forgotten about the penultimate stage of the design of the Guggenheim. One of my students was looking at the project this summer, and I'd look at the book and I said, well, that's amazing. If he had done that, it wouldn't be a famous building. He turned it upside down, and now it's famous. So I thought, well, that's, you know, is this a contemporary moment? We were talking about in my pinup today. It's a kind of a cliche of the bankrupt suggestions from bad art teachers and bad architecture professors that when they don't know what to say, they say, why don't you turn your project upside down and take a look at it? And all of a sudden I'm thinking, like, I think actually turning things upside down, I don't remember what this building is, but I saw it, I was off a truck stop somewhere. It's got this funny point where, you know, there's that, you know, where a massive building, and there is that point exactly where a massive roof and a massive wall should meet, and they should meet quite securely. Of course, when you're there, that's its most delicate and fragile and disconnected portion of it. It's a fairly radical move. You go about 40 miles away, and you turn it upside down, and you have something that I think is even more radical. And this is, I don't want to talk about Le Corbusier, but I would talk about Herzog and de Meuron. It's funny, I don't get around that much, but I think I know most, at least in passing, most every architect I'm interested in. I have never met these guys, never seen them lecture, never anything. Absolutely no relationship whatsoever. But it's probably the architects that more consistently than everyone else I look at and I say, oh shit, that's exactly the right thing to be doing right now. Or even more so, that's surprising me, like, oh, I didn't think about that. That's it. I don't know how to describe it exactly. So of course here what I'm pointing out, not only do both buildings have this kind of exhedra form as their primary space, the primary space is on the exterior, but here it's exactly where you go and where the building meets the ground. Talk about where the roof meets the wall as being fundamental. That's even more fundamental, and it's exactly that part. For those, I'm sure a lot of you know the diagram of the project well. The ground splits open and you actually enter that point where the building meets the ground. When you're inside, it doesn't continue. There's actually a void space. So I always look at that and I always say, damn you, Herzog and de Meuron, how did you do that? Because apparently I don't know them. Personally, people have told me maybe I wouldn't want to meet them, but maybe other people here can answer to that. So this is, anyways, I wanted to just go through that because that's a range of examples of different projects and practices that I'm interested in, and I think is a little bit of how I think a lot of us interact with one another and how discussions and dialogues happen. I mean, the last thing I'll say about these guys that I find quite interesting, you know, there's a lot of, in a very annoying way, there's art practices that pose as architecture, there's architecture practices that pose as art. What's interesting here is it seems to be neither of them. It seems as if they've embraced the discipline of architecture and simply consider it a fine art. So it's you know, I don't know anyone who's done that. And then the last one, productive misunderstanding is going to go to, the Productive Misunderstanding Award goes to Sylvia Lavin. Not her productive misunderstanding, mind you, mine. On the left is an essay that was in the October issue of Art Forum. If you haven't read it, I suggest you do, called Vanishing Point. And it was a version of that. An earlier version of it was given here at SCI-Arc last summer. And in it, there's first off, it's a fascinating, devastating, and kind of hilarious critique of the pavilion. And you know, it's interesting and I think kind of brave, because I think there's certain aspects of it that would have been fundamental. She would have been instrumental in conceptualizing its validity in the first place. And so there's that, and I would recommend it for that reason. But then the second part, what she talks about here is saying, well, what's next? That this is not, the open experimentation quickly becomes co-opted and branded. That's not a refuge anymore. She's saying oddly, and the lecture's interesting, apparently we can't listen to it anymore. But she said that oddly, is there some way you re-engage other aspects of professional practice? I'm paraphrasing and probably incorrectly. She's saying, I don't know what to say, which doesn't sound almost stupid, like some kind of professional practice, and I don't mean that. The topic came up again briefly last week, I think, when Sylvia was speaking with Beatrice Colomina. I am not sure I understood it, but I certainly made something out of my misunderstanding, and it was pulling up the Claude-Nicolas Ledoux and his monograph, his treatise, which translates as architecture considered in relation to art, mores, and legislation. So mores could be maybe anything from lifestyle or customs. Legislation could mean literally that, or politics. And I thought, well, this is a very interesting possibility, that is there a way to not say architecture has to give up its, you know, its extreme, its fascination with extreme and unreasonable things, such as we specialize maybe here at SCI-Arc, and start dealing with the hard tacks of the political world of engagement. You know, it's not saying give up one and go to the other, which I would like to ask, and I know Tom Main couldn't make it here tonight, whether he means that. Sometimes, I hope he doesn't. I know sometimes it sounds like that. I think it means instead to understand the political potential that is absolutely ingrained in the very genetic code of the kind of unreasonable, purely disciplinary speculation that a place like this does so well. In other words, to understand how politics and things unfold from that as a set of new possibilities rather than saying, let's not do so much of that, let's do more of this. I'll talk about that a bit later when talking about the last project. I've been working on chairs and, you know, I hate sucking on bottles while I'm, it always seems a little uncouth. Thank you for your indulgence. 2 chairs. This is a thing I've been working on for a while, and I should mention this, and I'll show it again. There's been an amazing amount of, I was talking about Eric's work and different points of connection. It is not trivial to mention the kind of chance Eric took in bringing me out here, and the kind of support, you know, both from the atmosphere, the colleagues, and from Eric itself, that the school has given me has been spectacular, both in working on these chairs as well as the last project I've shown. There's been quite substantial support and help from the school, and it's been fantastic. Ming has been unbelievably supportive of these things. But that's enough. That's a slightly maudlin part. I want to thank. But with all sincerity, the chairs. You know, I thought about it. There's an interesting distinction that I would make. It's not going to be the topic of conversation this evening. The difference between architecture and design. I'm firmly of the belief that architecture is that the two are. It's critically important to understand the difference between the two, and when you're engaging in architecture, you have to make quite sure you're not engaging in design. For those of you that are interested, there was a kind of an interesting give and take, I think, in the last Harvard Design magazine between Michael Hayes and Penelope Dean. Penelope makes a very interesting and provocative discussion about the importance of introducing certain design approaches into architecture, and Michael sort of defends the discipline. As much as I hate to admit it, I understand the need to do that. I think of chairs that way. Like, I think there's furniture design, and I think there's chair design. I'd like to argue that there's also chair as an architectural project, you know, and at some point we thought, well, shit, how can you be an architect and not have done a chair? You got to do one at some point. So we thought, well, let's do one, and we worked on it for a long time. And we thought, well, it's possible, I should look into this and try to make sure that I'm working on it as an architectural project. I think a lot of you would know, if you look through certainly the 20th century, a lot of the really seminal examples of chairs from the 20th century are done by architects or people who are architects as well as furniture designers in general. Not that that's proof that it's an architectural project, and I'm not sure I could offer such proof, but I certainly can offer that hunch. So I got interested, you know, the Breuer chair. I knew this chair. And I started looking at it. This is before I even realized that he had basically ripped off Mark Stamm from 1926 and the first cantilever chair. I got very interested in the problem of the cantilever chair. Didn't pay so much attention to this. This is so commonplace as to be easily forgettable. But then started seeing these strange things, what I was calling the Italian cantilever. This is a rocking chair by Carlo Bugatti. And if you notice the different diagram here, well, of course it's a rocking chair, but both the back and the seat cantilever separately from the base, and then the seat goes backwards and almost intersects the plane of the back again. You see it again in, did I say Giuseppe? Did I say Carlo Bugatti, or did I say Turani? This is Giuseppe Turani, that was Carlo Bugatti. Sorry, too many Italians. The Turani, one of his chairs for the Casa del Fascio, again you see the same thing. The back and the seat are independently cantilevered, and then the arms actually cantilever again forward from that. The Zig-Zag chair by Gerrit Rietveld, also, you know, a fundamentally different diagram than the other ones. a whole series of very strange works by a Czech architect named Jindřich Halabala, and he really probably went further than anyone in terms of exploring alternative cantilevers for the, here's an example here. And then, so that's one line. I was interested in the cantilever chair and trying to figure out new ideas of the cantilever chair. Independent of that, I saw this project, was very, very taken by it, Greg Lynn's toy table. So this is sort of an extension of the previous discussion. I might put Greg in the category with Neil, who's a friend, a colleague whose work I followed but never really felt like it had much impact on me until I saw this. And I remember distinctly seeing it one morning coming into my class at SCI-Arc, showing pictures of it and writing on a blackboard, NEW. I said, I don't know what this is, but this is new. We have to follow this. And I still feel that way. It's an interesting chronology of projects. I'm sure you all know the blob wall, which was here, and I'm sure a lot of you also know the dolphin fountains. I think this is the most sophisticated of the three. It has the geometry of the blob wall, but is willing to risk literal, even laughable figuration, and maintains the Borromini, and I've talked to Greg about this, maintains the Borromini-like discipline of geometry, whereas the dolphin fountain goes into a kind of exuberance, let's say. So I was interested in the degree to which one can work. It's a longer discussion, but why one would reintroduce literal figuration into architecture, but I'll just say I think it's important. But at the same time, to bring it in a way that isn't simply quite explicitly not a kind of postmodernism, but to bring it in order to undermine certain kinds of, I suppose, exhausted means of approaching the abstract through increased minimalism. Right? So I'm interested in the abstract. You can't do it by making it simpler and simpler. So I thought, is there a Trojan horse for literal figuration in this? So, but thinking of a strategy, I thought that's not going to quite work for a building. So I thought of another comparison. Donald Judd, which, I never find so interesting. What I found more interesting than Donald Judd is Fred Sandback. And I thought, well, that's amazing. He is able to have the sense of those forms, yet with almost none of it there. Virtually nothing is there. You just get the sense of that geometry with no matter whatsoever. I thought it's great to be able to separate those two things. Can something be done with this strategically? So in other words, you have this, and then you're able to construct a series of lines, and those take the place of that. So what we got interested in was imagining the intersection of various obvious and even comical figures, and then seeing if one could say maybe the toolpath, that line where those things intersect, whether one could extract, let's say, the DNA and sense of the figure without actually bringing it in. That was our interest. This was a studio I ran here a while ago, an urban studio. I had students working on it. This was working actually on rubber ducks. You can get to vaguely see some of the rubber duck profiles, I think, in there. So those were two separate lines of inquiry. I go to the Vitra Museum. I see this version of Marchstam's chair with a black line in space and with such an ephemeral frame. And I said, aha, this is it. I'll do a new cantilever chair, find a new cantilever chair diagram, and let it be a case of, instead of, because if you could say this is sort of making a Donald Judd, right? So this is making something that's not the Donald Judd. It's making some other kind of figure. So I'll go first, the cantilevers. There's books on cantilever chairs, far from exhaustive. There's books on tubular chairs, which are quite exhaustive. If you ever see this book, it's fascinating. It's exactly what it says. 2,100 metal tubular chairs. But it covers everything, so it's not just specializing in cantilever, and it doesn't get into the non-tubular ones. We couldn't find anything in between the two. I think that project still is out there to be made. But we did, anyways, a little bit of what one might call a survey of the art form, and did enough for us to feel like we could make a reasonably intelligent stab at understanding the territory. So if you go through a whole series of, this is the classic, the Stamm and the Breuer copies of it, going through the to the Brno chair by Mies. Mies introduces curvature and other things into it. Still all, even though the arm becomes a slightly separate diagram, it is always the base coming forward to the front, going back, and then the back being integral with it. Then varying ways in which the arms relate to, it's a different diagram for the arms than we see here. This Breuer easy chair, actually it's interesting, it's a little more complex than it looks. For those of you who sat in it, it's not fixed there, so it actually is quite a large spring. It's kind of an interesting chair. These other odd ones, these work chairs, same diagram and profile, but of course it's from a single line, so you get a weird kind of asymmetry going in them, which is quite rare in chairs. The Panton chair, fascinating because the diagram is understood only as a sweep. If you cut the profile, the diagram would fall backwards. If you cut it in the middle, the diagram would fall forward. It's just by the constant curvature of one to the other that provides its stability. The zigzag, which is interesting because it starts in the back, goes forward, and goes back again. I'm going to go into this for just a little bit. I could spend a long time, but I won't. But that's unusual. So you have the Roche chair and the Rietveld chair that goes back and forth. And then we get into a whole series of the Gingerich Halabala, where it's a kind of a curved version of the other one. But again, the forward and back, so it makes a kind of spring. And you can see in the bottom one, which really looks like a deep knee bend. And this is a kind of a monopole chair that comes forward, but with a similar kind of diagram. Getting into more halabalas, where they swing back in on themselves. So again, you can follow through. You're going, the cantilever is coming forward and then backwards again. Other chairs where the two ends cantilever both from the center. And again, the Italian ones. A Carlo Bugatti, a snail chair, which is a bit of the backward one, and then some Turani, both where it's the simple one where the two cantilevers come from the ground, and then one where it comes back forward again. Tatlin here in the metal version of his famous chair. This is relatively rare, and we explored this, where the seat leans forward. There's a kind of logic, of course, because cantilever chairs typically work as a spring, that when you sit in it, you want to kind of going backwards, you don't want a diving board that you slide off of. But the Stamm does it. I've actually not sat in it, and so I can't say how well that works, and I'll just go through a couple of other iterations that we see here. A very strange one here. Myself trying to figure out sideways ones, backwards. The asim is difficult. I haven't quite cracked that nut. So what we figured out then to put the two together is then we started working on the figure and realized that by carefully manipulating the intersections, you could start to result diagrams that would start to map against certain kind of cantilevers. So we were able to put the Rodi pony together in ways to get the zigzag and other ways to get the Turani, etc. So we developed a certain kind of expertise on these intersections in order to do that, and then we had to find a willing guinea pig. Big Boy was tried, and the hairdo, I think it was the cowlick, just kept getting to me. It turned out it was too bumpy, and you could see a couple of examples here. My Little Pony, or as we called it in the office, My Little Pony, seemed more appropriate, and eventually we were able to have our way with it. Another feature, and it's a perverse feature, mind you, I don't wish this on anyone, but one feature of the tubular chair, it's of course intrinsically tied into a certain kind of modernist production sensibility. That is to say, you would have a tube that was of a constant radius, and you would have a tube whose bend was always of a regular, it was a radius, a constant diameter of tube and a regular arced radius for the bend. Virtually all of the chairs that I'm showing you, certainly the tubular ones, follow this logic. We got interested instead in the line itself taking on a kind of expressivity. And so the chair that we ended up with has two features that are different. Number one, it is never a radius curve. It's always a kind of a spline curve. And the diameter of the tube is never consistent. It's always inconsistent. as you can imagine, that basically all of the production logic of the modernist chair goes out the window. But you do end up with these things where, it's as much as anything, it looks like a kind of drawing. We thought it would actually look like a kind of charcoal or ink drawing in space was a desirable component. Although in the early studies, we were giving a kind of literal thick-thin based on the radius. These are different cushion studies. I can talk about these longer. I'll just cut to the winner of the beauty contest. And this is the chair. The radius is based on other criteria, decidedly not on the structural forces. We worked very hard to make sure it would both stand up and didn't look like it was responding to those forces. I should mention with this project and a couple of others I'm showing, I worked with Bruce Danziger. I shouldn't say probably with Arup because I don't think they would, I think this is kind of his weekends and evening thing. It turns out there aren't really chair engineers. He did it for fun. So the cushion here is a kind of independent operation from the rest of the chair, and the chair itself has this kind of thick and thin. This is a full-scale mock-up of it, and you can see this kind of quasi-regular pattern that the cushions are going to have. This is just a big paper mock-up, full size. This chair is going to be, let's see a couple of views of it. Oh, I forgot to tell you the name. This one is called, hang on, Boing! And you have to say it, there's an exclamation mark at the end is why I have to say it like that. The chair itself, and it's in production right now. We had a couple of hiccups with these double-sided mills. The chair itself is going to be cast bronze. And these are, it's cast in a traditional lost wax process. These are a bunch of the pieces that are now getting put together. They're a double-sided mill. I don't necessarily like showing your work, but I like these pieces. They look odd, like some kind of natural history museum. There's a kind of lap joint that puts them together. They get put together as a frame, and then they get cast. A master is made, and then they're cast. The seat back and seat are aluminum shell, fiberglass shells rather, and then there's a negative mold in which there's an expanded foam that makes the rest of it. We're still trying to figure out how to, the first prototype we're just going to sew together a cover for it. We're trying to figure out how that happens exactly. So when I'm talking with Bruce, I give him this big crazy chair. He says, I can't analyze it, let's start from some straight lines and work backwards. So I said, okay, so here you see, and I guess after all that discussion, I should mention just a cantilever. So what you have here is you start here, difficult to see. This comes forward from the ground this way, and these come back like that. So it is a kind of contortionist where the seat starts from the back. Instead of it being the back like a Tirani chair, it comes forward and makes the seat. And this comes all the way back and makes the arm. So the two pass through each other and make the chair that way. And so these diagrams show that. And you can see a little bit that this comes this way and the other piece goes that way. Has a little bit of the diving board problem, but then we fixed it by having this kind of backward of the zigzag chair. In fact, this one is called the Zag-Zig. Only because it's the opposite of the zigzag, no other reason. And then as we're putting these together, we thought, oh shit, these look like nice chairs. So we thought, well, we could have a kind of couture version, and this is sort of the ready-to-wear. And so the Zag-Zig now is going to be produced, and in fact, we just got a call so we thought, the March Stamm, there's this very, very famous pipe version of it. And so, we did one of those as well, our Home Depot version of the chair. Bruce did some things with it, but we really didn't know whether it was. So we thought, what is the most grueling structural analysis we could possibly run on a chair like this? It doesn't fall down. So, just to show you the geometry of it, this could have been a March Stamm chair. It's the diagram that's fundamentally different. There's nothing about this at all, and in fact, this is just going to be ready tomorrow, and we're going to have this prototype of that welded together. This has its own patterning logic for the seat that I'm not going to get into right now. Surface studies, I think some of you may know these. I'm just showing them. These are, I had a couple of them as sold at SCI-Arc auctions. Not completely unrelated to, say, the duck table problem, looking at abstraction and image and limits of those things, and I call these elevation studies. They're made from cardboard boxes. They're tiled, they're not woven, so each one is made out of, in this case, 4 boxes, and so the composite ends up being the size of the area of all 4 unfolded boxes put together, as opposed to a weave. And these, in fact, had holes in it also. This was actually for a lace auction. It's a small one. This was the 9-box problem, which was quite a difficult one. It's quite large. They have to be a square root. You can do a 4-box, you can do a 9-box. We're working, I don't know as we've figured out exactly. There's a short film, I'm not going to show it tonight. We were working through different ideas to try to figure out how these turn into elevation ideas. I'm not sure that we have that worked out yet. But this idea of working with 2-dimensional things and the relationship of 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions, maybe that would be a longer discussion, but certainly of interest to us. The idea of misregistering surfaces off of each other so that the change of material doesn't coincide with the change of geometry, as is the default, of course, in most construction, is of interest to us. We've done that in a few projects, trying to work out the details of how that happens, try to see if Cheez-It might be interested in a misregistered box designer. I thought the way like Converse gets designers to do special shoes for them, I thought Cheez-Its, I could do that. And then more relevant, and this is what I wanted to show, a kind of a confusion made between, like you misunderstand what a 2-dimensional thing is and you thought it was 3 dimensions. It's not sure what it is. I'll show this in connection with the project later. We got very interested in this. We were calling it the cartoon butt. And so there's a little project we just finished in Kyoto, a small installation. It's a stairwell inside of a building, and inside of that stairwell, this is Matthew Ao and Fumio Hirakawa, who's Matthew, you might know. Fumio graduated from here maybe 10 years ago. He worked on Cypher, my installation that was here, and this is at Kyoto Seika. So they're putting together some very large stickers. And this is it installed. I literally, this was done a couple days ago. I just got these photographs, have not had a chance to see it. So I'm not sure what to say about it. I wish I was seeing it. It was intentionally put into a space where you couldn't really photograph it. In other words, it's so immersive you couldn't see it. What's difficult to pick up here, and you can see it a little bit maybe here, it's not flat, like wherever the folds are. They're actually at the low relief. There's a whole series of layers as if you had ironed out a sheet of paper after you folded it up there, and that's a kind of important part of it. I show that I'm not going to speak at all about the exhibition that's going to be going on here, because I know Todd's giving a lecture here, and he'll know then what the awkward position is. He's going to be speaking on it. It's a position you and Brenda, Todd, and myself have been working on as curators, and Zago Architecture has been working on as exhibition designers. I'm not, would love to talk about it at some point, but there's 2 things that we're doing as an entrance to the library gallery, a very large enlargement of a drawing by Craig Hodgetts and Robert Mangurian when they were studio works. And then in the entry outside of the gallery itself, a very, very large enlargement of these fake postage stamps that Tom and Michael were doing in the late 70s, which Michael just told me the post office tried to get them arrested for doing, because they were putting them there. I think they were trying to like mail drugs, or no, I'm sure they weren't doing that. Just trying to mail something with a fake postage stamp, that's crime enough, Michael, right? Okay, interlude. This is, I forgot to mention, did I tell you there's an interlude? All the interlude is, I'm just going to show some drawings. And Jeff told me it's really annoying to show things without talking about them, so just now I just talked about them. That wasn't so painful. I timed that one. It was like a minute and a half. Okay. A project, it was an open competition, Museum of Modern Korean History in the middle of Seoul, showing it because it has certain features that I think are topical. Certainly, I think it'll be recognized in certain ways around the school. Seoul, for those of you that don't know it, let's see, the South Gate is here. This is on the north of the Han River. The City Hall here, this is where all the million people hung out during the World Cup some years back. This main street here leads right to a palace gate and an entire, is that Gyeongbok Palace here? Right along here, which is where, here is where the former administration uncovered a formerly buried river and did it at the scale of things I know Eric's talked about that Korea seems to do as a matter of course that we seem to have lost the nerve for largely in this country. But a whole series of important buildings had always been here, and so is the case now. There's two identical buildings here. This is the current U.S. Embassy. It's going to move eventually. Another one here, I believe two of the early cast-in-place concrete buildings in Seoul following the Korean War. This other administrative building was being vacated, but somehow you had to keep the building. It wasn't that you had to keep any feature of it other than its basic concrete frame, but you had to keep that building and turn it into a museum of Korean history, say, since the Chosun Dynasty over the last 100 years or so. So we found it interesting, and it's amazing. First off, we really got into the splendor of Korean Baroque sculpture. Had no idea John Bologna was... we're all getting tired. I'll just signal when it's a joke. I'll do that. Jeff likes to show this one, and it's a great example. John Bologna, The Rape of the Sabine Women. It's the idea of form, in this case, so exuberantly so, being formed from an inner logic to the geometry, bounding outwards. So whether we're talking about a box, whether we're talking about an arm, whether we're talking about any number of shapes, it is so common that one tends not to think of it, that form is something that has its logic and its kernel internal to itself, and then there's a skin that terminates that, and that's the way that works. And I would argue it's a kind of exclamation mark. In other words, that form and architecture does this very well. It does it as a matter of course. It tends to exert itself positively into the environment and cast the background white as just that, as background. The more ambiguous diagram, as much for sports records as I think as it is for architecture, is the asterisk. It's like, wait a minute, it's not quite so declarative. It's a more complex diagram, and that just for every moment that the thing is outwardly bounded, like the exclamation mark, at the same time it's kind of inwardly bounded, and so it has a complex relationship to the surrounding space, negotiating a there and a not there. I would argue it's a kind of it's a certain description of weak form. A classic example. I could show examples of architecture from myself and from others where this was explored a number of years ago. We were sort of interested in going a step further than that, and I was warned by my colleague Elena Manfredini not to show how-to diagrams. I'm just going to show one set, no other one. But it was this idea, that this would be like the exclamation mark, the outwardly bounded form, and was imagining instead if one could think of something that, in other words, if you took a bunch of those John Bologna statues together, imagine the rape of the Sabine women going on, and then you just pour plaster in between everyone and ask everyone to leave, like what would actually be left over. So everything is, all your materializing is the opposite of it. I say it, this is one of these things, Hernan blames me for spreading this like kudzu around SCI-Arc. I didn't mean to. But anyways, this idea that everything is formed from inside. The cusp edge reveals that there's no inside force pushing out, it's the outside force pushing in. And sometimes it takes the form of geometry, Boolean geometry. Not always. This is a sculpture by David Nizio. It turns out it's just blocks of salt, and he had sheep lick them. So. Next time, who needs a 3D printer? They make perfect inclusions. But I'd like to just point out that it need not be a kind of Boolean operation. Here's one of Hiroshi Sugimoto's photographs from Conceptual Forms, I think was the series. It's a mathematical, it's like a surface calculator, a graphing calculator for something called a Kuhn surface. And then when we saw it like this, we realized also the materiality of it could change and maybe start to suggest, these are called kats, K-A-T, that certain traditional hat of the Chosun dynasty in Korea. I want to point out one thing here. We approached the project with a certain interest within the discipline, which had to do with those diagrams and the outside form and the inside form. We looked at the site. In other words, we come with a certain portfolio of interests, either peculiar to us or let's say more widely to the field. We see a site which has the kind of pagoda roofs of the entrance and a certain kind of history. And it's not that we say, oh, now I have an architectural idea, maybe I can find something about that, maybe I can make something out of that. It was really more saying that within our arsenal, it seems like there was something that could create a kind of dialogue and have a kind of traction with the sensibility that one finds there. So very early, this was a few years ago, we were really doing like the sheep licking the salt. And then eventually, I mentioned a couple of names here of people who work on things with me. They are legion, and many of them are in this room, and I've had the good fortune to work with some phenomenally talented people. But I mentioned here Sarah Blankenbaker, because she was our and remains a kind of grasshopper wizard for these studies and some of the other things we've been working on. But just mapping out varying degrees of complexity within this and odd things that fall into that line as Bob Somel says between a geofact and an anthrofact. Like when they say that in anthropology, you pick up something and you try to figure out, like, am I looking at a rock or did someone actually make this? It's a fine line there. So just a minute about the site, now that I spoke about the form. So there's the gate, and here's this. Korea was a city after their boom. They traffic engineered it to death. It was kind of a strange, inhospitable place, although I quite love it. It's changed quite a bit. They did a major plaza here. There's big events taking place here all the time. They're changing their whole urbanism. And so we looked at these kind of traditional kind of walled compounds. This is I forgot what it's, someone know. It's a place where all the kings are buried, and modern architects love it. Anyways, you walk in and you're in a kind of enclosure. You go under this gate and you follow this other thing. What we thought instead is we would fold down that front gate in a sense to this plaza, and then what you would do is you'd entirely walk under the building. The building itself would be like that gate, which is sitting right here. You'd walk under it up onto a hill and then zigzag back and forth. So instead of doing that, you kind of circulate through the building. Because this was an existing power plant that needed to remain, so we put another building on top of that, and you just a little bit of a sense here, just to see how you move through it from underneath the building through this kind of manifold into this space and then back through, and you wiggle through it. We keep the existing building. There's very little window requirements. It's a lot of these like experience the world of Korea kind of multimedia things. So we worked out a skin that is a perforated metal system. We didn't win the competition, by the way. So you can see here the plans. There's some modifications of it. It was basically given. We just had a certain distance in which we could propose this. It's a little dark on the screen, but it is a perforated screen that is more opaque in the center, and the perforations get bigger out at the edge. So the existing building is there, but gets hidden, and it gets a kind of halo as you go further out. And here you see the relationship to the building behind it. There we go. We're on to the last project. Am I doing okay? How am I in time? Okay. So Property is a project for Rialto, California. This is a little while ago. We were fortunate enough to be approached by the Museum of Modern Art to be one of the 5 firms in the United States to look at a different city, small suburban city within a large metropolitan area within the United States that had undergone some substantial stress during the foreclosure crisis. This was the second in a series of exhibitions that Barry Bergdahl, the head curator, organized, in which the museum was proactively seeking out projects to be done and then exhibited which for, as much as one can say positively or negatively, it's quite brave to just say, not give me that painting or give me that drawing, but just come and do something and we're going to show it. Barry used to call it extreme sports curating, which, maybe it is. But nonetheless, we were asked to do this. We were given some studies done by Reinhold Martin at the Buell Center for American Architecture on some statistics and some locations on there, and a fairly explicit attitude about what we were asked to look at, which is the relationship of universal single-family home ownership, the American suburb, and the American dream. And is there an opportunity to revisit all of these in light of the foreclosure crisis? And more importantly, and I'm not sure it was taken by everyone quite so literally, but I think one thing that Barry did that I admired greatly was not just to take up these problems, but to say what would happen if architects engage these problems. In other words, can an architect have anything to say in this? And so it wasn't simply a matter, I think, of an architect being part of a team of consultants dealing with a complicated problem, but what would happen? Do you believe in a certain efficacy of our profession that we could actually lead and shape that broader discussion? Now, and this is where we took off from. Reinhold Martin had put together a thing called the Buell hypothesis, that looks at this idea of the public investiture, the idea of public housing, single-family homeownership, et cetera. His argument was change the dream and you change the city. In other words, and I think he has a kind of it is his theoretical mindset that architecture and the built environment is largely a artifact that reflects the various kinds of political, economic, and aspirational forces that shape it. In other words, that one could map out all of these forces, a kind of, a critical view of architecture, that architecture is an instantiation of these forces, and if you change those forces, then the architecture comes out differently. We said, no, we took the opposite view. We took, in fact, the first meeting I quoted Winston Churchill, which is always good. I like to show Ronchamp, quote Winston Churchill, show Franklin. I only left out, I think, Leonardo da Vinci. Otherwise, I would have all of the really famous people here. But he had a quote, which is, "We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us," which I always thought was incredibly powerful. It is. And I think I remember once a brief discussion with Eric. It's not necessarily he's saying a nice thing, right? I mean, for every liberating and inspirational experience and exhilarating experience that those buildings thereafter shape, there is also the soul-numbing sameness, repetitiveness, dangerousness that buildings can do. So it is a relationship. It's a complex relationship. But I think that's true. What it says, though, is we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. It's not we're shaped and our buildings look like us. It's an incredibly important difference, I think, for architecture, and goes back to the point that I was talking about with Sylvia's question and how I perhaps understood it my own way, which is that is there can we say that it is our unhealthy, obsessive investigations into our concerns, our techniques, our processes, our diagrams. Is this our fun toys that we have to put away when we engage the world, or is in fact all of the important motion in the world caused by people bringing exactly those obsessions to the table? I'm not sure, I don't feel like I'm necessarily explaining myself so clearly. I'm saying it's like, you need, it's like, I remember in Detroit, I know this is a kind of a Reagan joke, but it definitely would happen in Detroit. Like, the last thing they would want is for someone to go there because they want to help them. It's like, oh shit, it's time to run. Like, are you good at something and are you interested in doing that? Then maybe you can come here. Don't just come here because you want to help us. So I think we should be like that. Like, it wasn't like, oh shit, I can't be my crazy obsessions are not going to help these poor people that are kicked out of a home. It's like, no, that's what I have, and I actually believe that it can it can organize a whole series of other disciplines, that architecture should actually be a kind of prime organizing discipline, and that us releasing it's a different kind of politic to release creative novelty into the world, that engenders its own open-ended sense, its own open-ended and it's open-ended, previously unknown forms of engagement with the world. Oops, sorry, backwards. So property with properties, I should change the city. Just one last thing, property with properties, one of our consultants on the team, I'll mention the rest, was Bob Somel, who would very much fall into the category, would be closest to Jeff, someone that I've known for a long time and who's always shockingly sharp and quick mind, never ceases to catch me off guard with his offhand comments. Property with properties was his title. So this is Rialto, California. It's a community, this is actually unincorporated land just north of Rialto, California. It would get eventually absorbed into it. 2,400 homes and about 500,000 square feet of commercial space. That's Highway 15, branching off of the 10, which is further down here, on its way up to Las Vegas. This is not only the San Bernardino Mountains, but this is the beginning of the San Bernardino National Forest. So it's hard up against there, Lytle Creek rushing out of the mountains. You know, you literally just drive up this road a half mile and you've got eagles flying around and wilderness and streams. And so this is there. It came online. There's others. I worked, and I'll mention the others as well, with David Bergman on this, who can explain the background of the problems much more clearly. But it's a giant process of entitlement of the land, development of it. There's a grading, there's a drop where every house site is like a foot lower than the one adjacent to it. Infrastructure put in, paving. 10% of the homes go in, and it basically, the financial crisis hit, it has a heart attack. And so the whole complex mechanism, timing, and cast of characters and regulatory hurdles that go from scrubland to a California subdivision is fascinating, and it is very much, as you might imagine, a very precise formula. And when that gets halted, when it does, as this one did, all bets are off. We went back to 2009, which is what we were asked to do for the exhibit, and say if federal money for the Federal Reinvestment Act was spent differently and spent on this kind of, on the problem of foreclosure, what could happen? So we went there and we thought many of these, like GMAC is getting rid of some of the parcels here as toxic assets, et cetera. This was a classic, Lehman Brothers was involved with part of the financing. So rather than simply making the bank whole, that, you know, the bonds and things would get rescued in exchange for a kind of re-engineering of the codes of ownership, of construction, of ecological relationships, et cetera, that a subdivision has. You do that, you get the money, and we have a fairly clear plan for it. Now, this is as you can see, these are some model homes there. It's sitting out there in the wilderness. There's the mountains right behind it. This is, in fact, you can see all of the stepping for the sites. And so what we thought, and this is exactly what we were talking about, what I was just talking about, the idea of misregistration, I was showing you some ideas about it before. I have some how-to diagrams for it, which for Elena's sake I'm not showing, but this idea that one could, as an architectural interest, decouple material properties from geometry seems, was of interest, let's say. We looked at this project and we thought, you know what, if you look at these developments, what you really have is onto this kind of continuity of nature, varied and difficult, but continuity of nature. A series of lines and edges are put in, and those edges are where all of these things happen. So this side of the edge is inside the development, that side is wilderness. This is a building, this is not a building. This is my property, this is yours, this is lawn, this is paved, this is public, this is private. We understand that, that's what happens, and it's what creates the unbelievable kind of monoculture of these kinds of suburban developments. There's one kind of financing model, there's one kind of vegetation, there's one kind of building type, et cetera. And so we saw that as a problem. We started to think about what our tools of misregistration, what happens if that suddenly gets applied to real estate, models of ownership, models of surface treatment, models of ecological interface, et cetera. So what would happen if you don't simply cast out those things, because that's not like a bad comic book. It's not that you lose the image, it's that you lose that absolute line that says this is one thing and this is something else. So this was our kind of opening salvo, and this is what we mean by property. So you would give property more properties. Now, all right, I might be able to go through this rather quickly for the following reason, and this goes back to what I was saying before about having a professional discussion rather than let's say, a kind of layperson's discussion. This is a project which I've had to present, and my colleagues have presented a great many times to David Bergman and I presented it to the planning department at MIT. We've presented it to city planners. We've presented it to lay public. We've presented it to the press, etc. There's a dialogue that goes with this. And so let me assure you that we have, and not that I'm far from advertising my website, but if you go there, what we did for the project, it had so many components to it, is there's a series of 4 animations that describe, let's say, the extra architectural components of it. So there's a very long description of the ownership, finances, entitlements, etc. What was supposed to happen, what did happen, what could happen with ours. David was our maestro, our genius of that. I'll just show this later briefly. Working with Bruce Danziger at Arup, we took the stick-built suburban home and we thought we could re-engineer it, that we had to go that fundamentally. And so we looked at SIPS panels, we worked it out down to the point of re-engineering SIPS panels for unlocked structural potential with Bruce, and worked it down to a series of building details. Working through Bruce with a lot of the other Arup people, we had large-scale ecological systems and recycling systems in terms of central plants for it. Working also with transportation people at Arup, we re-engineered the cul-de-sac subdivision, what we call the third type. If you know Albert Pope's work, an alum, of ladders, the centripetal and the centrifugal, I think we came up with a third type, which we call the Hills of Silver Lake model. And then finally, working with an ecologist in Connecticut, we developed a whole series of unusual ecological corridors, both straightforward ecological corridors, but also some very unusual ones that involve African elephants. So what I'm saying is each of these could be a lecture, and we've done it in and of themselves. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to talk about that. I just want to show we really just put together, I've had a packaged lecture for it, a series of them for different audiences. I'm not going to do it tonight. We pulled together, my partner Laura Bouwman and I, we pulled together a whole series of things that we hadn't necessarily shown before, and I'm just going to show them. Not so much because I feel like showing, like show your work, and there's that discussion about whether that's a good idea or not. But just because I think we went through a lot of interesting things in the course of doing this project, and I just thought I would just show them to you. That's it. Working through the misregistration and the degree to which it is like or is not like a kind of iconic form of the house with the gabled roof. The idea of the inclusion, that this is actually composed of a whole series of roofs from that subdivision pressed into a block, and so all you have is space between the houses rather than the houses themselves. A series of increasingly exotic geometric tests on it. Going back to Tom Main's building, trying to imagine what it would mean to maybe, instead of misregistration, maybe we can weaken the edges of some of these buildings, which ended up being not so much the case. And then looking again at misregistration and whether we could make part of the confounding of what's what would be through this series of slippages. There you see the cartoon bud again. Inversions of the outside to the inside, which we call the inclusion, and a series of study models that we went through a lot of things in the course of this project. Just briefly working with Bruce and this idea of the SIPS panels. You all know them. They've been around since the 1940s or 1950s, but they're typically not used as a kind of modified monocoque, which is what Bruce engineered for us. And so the thought is that on one hand you could have a new structure, but you would be able to maintain the same crews constructing it. Does that make sense? This is from one of the display boards, not terribly technical, but you get an idea of the construction. And then it was an odd thing, and I know I've had this discussion with John Enright of 20, so we increased the density by about 1.5 times, which is a lot. It's not an urban density, but it certainly isn't a typical suburban density. And we never did that. Like, I know how to design one house. I understand multiple housing, like apartments. Just doing a bunch of single homes, we weren't sure. So at first we thought, like, okay, let's make every house different. And through the magic of scripting, of course, we were able to quickly generate 2,000 completely different homes. I guess no two actually match. I haven't double-checked Sarah's math on this, but I'm going to bet she's right. But then quickly realized we didn't need that. That actually, through the combination of houses and the juxtaposition of them on the site, we could do something a lot like a suburban development where you have a handful of types and we increase the variety in other ways. And this is one. This is like, we only made a few perspectives of the whole thing, which I'll talk about at the end. And these were we actually reproduced the exact look of the pages from the old Sears and Roebuck catalog. We used to be able to order a house. So the perspective like this on top and then the floor plans, we thought we would do that. And then working through patterning, which is maybe a slightly more difficult discussion to have. This was an early version, which we showed at our kind of midterm review of the project, but then got into, in a very serious way, in terms of our attempt anyways, looking at the generation of patterns, part mathematical and part through, Owen Jones and so these are some of the individual pieces that were generated for the homes. And the color, we looked, and I'll show an example later, at some incredible Persian miniature paintings where color and pattern create a kind of architectural atmosphere that seemed desirable. So it was really quite, that the exterior space, rather than just being the side yard between houses with the little monopoly houses, that the exterior itself would be a kind of gorgeous indulgence, gorgeous, but a kind of indulgence like that. Here's one of this was actually part of the ecological project, but I'll talk about that later. What was funny is, like, the same time that we finished this, last winter's Prada collection comes out, and I thought, oh shit, we must be onto something. So ours is considered the Prada of, and then with the site plan so that's the building, the site plan with its own set of investigations, how to wire the cul-de-sacs. We didn't want to simply replace it with an urban grid, nor did we want to keep it, and that's it's a different discussion, but here's a series of studies. Actually, these are all Paul Stolting, who worked, one of the several people who worked on it, but these are his, I think, quite beautiful drawings. My office is always Bachelor of Fine Arts friendly. And then how the streets to block to property start to blend and interact with one another. I mean, we tried, like I showed that photograph, that's like a real misregistration. You take apart the CMYK and shift it. It really couldn't work that way for us. We really had to figure out ways that were much more nuanced, but still had that look as if you just did something stupid, like something went wrong there and you didn't plan it so much. So we ended up oddly with a kind of, set of offsets and a kind of radial geometry in it, as much as the final one appears to have a different kind of complexity. So it was a riff, those cul-de-sac streets, they're all done with arcs, and so really it was a kind of riff on that. And what happens, and I'll talk about this again later, once you put a house on every property and begin moving around these boundaries, suddenly they start, stuttering. And so we end up with a lot of things. We end up still with quite a few single-family homes, which was important to us, so you can have that American dream. There's a whole other part of property where half of it's conventional mortgaged property, fee simple, and other parts are land banked, so you can buy into a kind of community-owned land and get the house cheaper, but that's more of a discussion for David. But you absolutely can get a single-family home and get a mortgage on it. You also get an incredible array of duplexes just by virtue of the technique, and that's why we didn't need so many houses, because you get so many combinations. And then in some cases it even goes into sort of zippers of row houses and townhouses. And here's some other views of that. Testing the patterning on the surface itself because we wanted a certain continuity or a certain insane insistence on pattern, on pattern, on pattern. This is just test, outtakes. The final site plan, it's a large, very fine line drawing, difficult to see. Here's a little bit of a detail of it where you see the sort of stuttered homes in the streets and some of the other geometry, the more complex subdivision of lines. Color was a sort of obsessive feature of this project, and we certainly went through a lot of it. Here you see a partial site plan. You get an idea. One thing you can see is, we wanted the whole model to look like when you look at this photograph, we want you to think someone printed the photograph wrong, and there's a sort of misregistration. And I got to tell you, painting buildings one color and the ground a different color, easy. Painting the buildings slightly off from, very difficult. It turns out there's a reason why people don't misregister materials and geometry. And then typologies that we go from townhouses to a wide variety of duplexes to single-family homes. This is a townhouse, one of the duplexes. Here's another one. There's features, there's an animation I won't show that explains what happens to how these courtyards are created, and these things that I was referring to before, these involutes, these pieces that come in the courtyards, they end up sort of facing each other. So even if it's the plans aren't necessarily so important or groundbreaking, except that they're set up as interlocked two-family homes. Sometimes you get a very large home, a very small home. Sometimes you get two equal homes. But often there are these involutes that stare into one another, and I'll show you that in the model. So here you see in the model, the second screen is a perforated metal screen that provides shading in this kind of near-desert environment. But obviously is there for a lot of other reasons behind. And so you have paving, you have grasscrete, you have lawn, you have cobbles, you have a whole series of other things, and we have strategies for how to arrive at that narrowed road widths that I won't get into now. Trying to privilege also the space between houses rather than the space themselves through that kind of infusion. There you see the entrances into one of these involutes that fold in. This is part of the elephant thing. I don't want to explain it right now. That's looking into one of the courtyards. And then on the other side here you see where these, in a duplex, is how these involutes start to face one another. And then the plan. A film, I think I've talked about this around here. Pictures and drawings and the difference between the two. One of my pleasures and privileges at SCI-Arc is I'm the visual studies coordinator also, and so I just try to unreasonably insist on certain things. One drawing, one sheet of paper is one thing that to stop the tyranny of the plotter. And the other one is to know the difference between drawings and pictures, which means you can do drawings, but you have to know the difference between a drawing and a picture, otherwise known as perspectives. Enough already. So I won't go into it. I think we have been long. Leonardo da Vinci's study for the adoration of the Magi. You can switch around the camels and the horses. That's just moving deck chairs on the Titanic. The radical thing, the drawing of it, is the perspective itself, not what happens to be drawn in it. The fundamental idea of this representation is the perspective. There was a time, such as in this Urbino panel, when that was wildly radical to be able to control space and to shape architecture, and in turn, according to the kinds of laws of perspective, loosened already considerably into a kind of atmospheric approximation by the time we're looking at the vedute of Piranesi, right? So for all of these, for instance, I could be showing this, or we could look at the Campo Marzio. The Campo Marzio is like architect to architect, let's talk. The vedute is for the general public. What I want to point out is we all do representations, and we always will be doing representations, I think. They certainly have been doing it since then. but that it too has to be taken up as a problem. One can't simply think that a perspective render is axiomatically the way that things are represented. The panoramic painting in the round, it's fundamentally different in how the mechanics of it is fundamentally different than I did mention Leonardo da Vinci. Oh, I did get him in there, thank you. I'm not going to get Michelangelo. So this, anyways, so you go into contemporary sensibilities. This is Ed Ruscha showing every address on the Sunset Strip. Famous. This gets, with credit, co-opted by Venturi and Scott Brown for Learning from Las Vegas. So this is a contemporary thing. If you were to diagram out the difference between this, the continuous panorama, the Piranesi, et cetera, you're looking at different models of representation, but they keep track with a kind of contemporaneity. These are some things that, films that my partner Laura Bouwman and I had put together. In fact, we showed these here at SCI-Arc a few years ago, a kind of rough cut version. These are films of Detroit, which we call XYT, Detroit streets. I should mention, these are going to be shown. We finally finished a very high resolution version of this. It's going to be installed, hopefully in a big way, at the Art Institute in Chicago shortly. Again, I could diagram the difference between these and those, the previous things we looked at. It is, and I can. And so with this project, we thought, we were talking, this is the Night in the Palace. I mean, it's an amazing painting. Can't see what's inside, can't see what's outside. So in a way, we thought this could actually be a feeling for that subdivision. And I think sometimes some of the people who had seen it say, but you're showing everything in axonometric, people don't really understand that. And I'm like, you know how many tens of millions of people play Sim Family and it's completely an axonometric. What do you mean? It's like, maybe it would have made no sense to those who were looking at Piranesi's Vedute when they were produced, but times change. Actually, times change. No one thought of perspective before that was there. So now this is the very last thing I'm going to show, and I'm not even going to say hardly anything to it. It's just a film. It's going to go on for a few minutes, and just to avoid technical problems, I do not embed these films. Instead, I have them open. There we go. Oh. Ah. There. And in fact, with the exception of those small perspectives that I showed you, when we did this project for MOMA, we didn't have any perspectives. Instead of a big perspective, we had a very large vertically mounted monitor, high definition monitor, and this film would simply loop. It's a day in the life of, and so this is showing a lot of the features of it. I don't have much to say about it beyond that, other than this is sort of a fun game. Virtually everyone that was green screened into this is somehow connected to SCI-Arc as either faculty, student, or visitor. I think there's maybe one or two exceptions. So you see if you can spot them. Anyone? No, don't say it if you know already. Anyone know who that is? Jose Obery. Oh, we already missed. Oh, how about there? Where are you, Heather? Yeah, Heather. This? All of these babies? Baby Tycho, copied and pasted, Todd's kid. Is that Dwayne? Did you get filmed, Dwayne? Aaron and Aaron? Thing 1 and thing 2? Yeah, Ben Nicholson. This isn't quite the right resolution. If it's a little higher resolution, you can spot them quite easily. Is that you, Dale? Paul Meecomber's in here. Wait, you know who that is? There's our elephant. Eric Kahn. Tim? Sorry, I don't have anything else to say. This is just going to go on for another minute. And this was actually the rough cut. Those people weren't supposed to disappear suddenly. It's kind of interesting, you know, like all the people, like you see that circle, that's actually mapped. In other words, each person is filmed separately, standing in a different direction. And as the film pans, the circle changes. Do you know what I mean? The circle is actually an axis, so it shifts. I don't think, except a couple cases where people are right next to each other, I think every one is like a one by one put together. There's Todd with Tycho. After this, I'll be happy to take a series of yes and no questions. Yes, no, and maybe. It's almost done. See, it's California, so we have a step aerobics class going. It's an axis, so the people further away are the same scale as the people closer up. You get rid of that troublesome problem of perspective. That is just about it. You know what I'm going to do, since it's right at the end, I'm going to just pause it so we don't have my messy desktop showing up. Thank you.